Integrate
Integrate.
2024, and you had a great session
Thank
where
you.
which we called building an integration solution with GitHub Copilot chat,
Great.
right?
Yes.
Mm.
Yes. I mean,
Could
this
you
is
give
this
some?
is the many,
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
been to many of those conferences, the
Mm.
Integrate conferences. So Sarah Varner and the team are good friends of mine. And if you don't have an opportunity to go, or you do get an opportunity to go to the one next year, then absolutely do, because it's not. The one thing I love about that conference is, one, it's what Microsoft target to make sure they tell all the
Yeah.
good stuff, right? I mean,
Mm.
they tell you some good stuff at Build, of course they do, because that's one of the things they have to target. But they also tell you great sort of stuff that they're going to be releasing soon at Integrate. So that's great. It's also full of integration professionals. And obviously, I met you two there when I was over. And it was great because, again, we're a really small group of people who just get on with everybody. And I think it's really, really, for me, that kind of like the amount of time that we get to network in that event is really, really good. And there's a lot of events that happen afterwards. There's plenty of time between sessions as well. So it's a really good opportunity for you to meet people who are like-minded, because the community is small. So I've made lots of friends over the years out of that particular conference. But yeah, no, it's a great conference, and I think I chose to talk about GitHub Copilot chat. So I used to work at Microsoft, in the interest of disclosure, for a couple of years, and selling GitHub was one of the jobs that I had. And when Copilot chat came out, or when Copilot came out, it was this grand thing. I wanted to do something. A lot of the demos were all around, very obvious things. Here's how you fix things. Here's a piece of code which we already know how we can fix and do things with. It's very, very orchestrated. So I wanted to see what I could do in a real world scenario where maybe I wasn't an integration professional, or maybe I wasn't. I knew how to do integration, but I didn't know how to code it. So I wanted to just see how capable it was. So that was the genesis of the talk.
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say, and thank you for attending the session, you could get some places, but not others. And that's not to say that you will be able to eventually get to those other places. I think it's possibly likely you never will. But I think we'll solve those, like orchestrations or workflows was a great example of that. Can't really build them very easily. But I think we'll have tools inside Logic Apps to do that for us, so that doesn't matter. So a lot of the other stuff you can do some very interesting things in. But again, it's one of those things where, because it's trained on a massive amount of data that is the data that is there, it doesn't really learn your own stuff unless you have Windows open that already has that stuff in it. Then it can learn. But yeah, so I found it really useful, but probably not going as far as I needed it to.
Yeah. I remember that you very early on in your session talked about that Copilot is biased. And can you talk
Yes.
about, can you explain a little bit why is it important to know, and what?
Yes. I mean, you can imagine that essentially what it's trained on is public repos, right? GitHub public repos. So if you think about that and you think, okay, right, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have I'm going to write some C# code. That's fantastic. There's a lot of C# code in those repositories, JavaScript, all those sorts of things. I'm going to write some Python code. Again, fantastic. I'm going to write some Fortran code. Probably less fantastic because there's not as much Fortran code out there. And I think one of the examples I showed was writing assembly to read and write from a file, which it would do. It was, you'd probably never be able to execute it. You'd have to have something. You'd have to have like a runtime engine to do that. But then you go to the other side of that and you go, okay. And one of the examples that I tried to show was how you could build an Azure function to read and write to a service bus queue. Now, a lot of code is using the old namespace, right? So not surprisingly, the first time you run it, it brings in a lot of code that's the old namespace, and you have to just tell it that you don't want to use that namespace; you want to use the latest namespace. So it's biased, but it doesn't devolve the developer of the responsibility to know what's current as well. So it's not like ChatGPT or any of those chat type engines. It's not like those where you just ask it to do things. You have to have the mindset that you know the kinds of things you want as an outcome.
Yes.
Right. So it's biased, and once you understand that it's biased, you need to know how to get it to work. Use that bias in your favor. I want to use the latest. I want to use the latest namespace. Give it the namespace name.
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is difficult. You'd probably know, or you could
Mm.
certainly look it up. So
Yeah.
One of the most key points, and what amazed me about your session on integrate, was like you was able to actually create a whole integration
yeah,
within 25 minutes while talking, while having the presentation,
Mhm.
while being under pressure.
While having fun.
Yes, exactly. It's like how do you see that is impact for if, like in effectivity? Because it's like I do understand what you're saying by co-pilots being biased, and it's a co-pilot. It's called co-pilot. It's not the pilot. You are the pilot,
Yeah.
not
correct, and
it.
that was the point I was trying to make, right? I think it's all very well. I both like the phrase co-pilot and dislike the phrase co-pilot. I like the phrase co-pilot because it says this thing is here to help you,
Yeah,
right? So you're the pilot and it's there to help you, right?
Mm.
So that's good, right? It doesn't devolve you of the responsibility because you're the pilot, you're in charge.
Mm.
But of
still have.
course, but I'm also my undergraduate degree was in aeronautical engineering, right?
Mm.
So I also know planes very well, and
Mm.
we all know. I mean, you don't need to know planes to know this particular fact, but we all know that generally it's the first officer, it's the co-pilot who flies, right?
Mm.
So it's like, well, co-pilot can also mean that you're the most important person on the plane for most of the time, but that's by the by, that's just an analogy. But I think the key thing with it is, and it is about that bias, and it is about that responsibility. When the other co-pilot tools that you find in things like Microsoft 365 and everywhere else,
Mm.
you can ask it to write an email that brings in information from a document and summarizes it and puts it in. That doesn't mean that at the end of that you can click send.
Mm.
I mean, you
Yeah,
can, but what happens if you've got your microphone on and you're talking to somebody and you say something that it picks up and transcribes that into your email? Yeah, so it doesn't remove your responsibility to look at what
Yeah.
it's built. And I think what I was trying to show is that in areas where there's a high requirement around code, actual
Mm.
code, things like
Mm.
the example that I showed was building a function. It does an okay job
Mm.
once you ask it the
yeah,
right question. Once you
exactly.
prompt it in the right way, it actually does a really good job. And it's not meant to write all the code for you.
Mm.
It's meant to give you a starting point.
Mm.
So I'm actually trying to create an evolution of that presentation, which
Mm.
is called building a social network
Mhm.
using Copilot Chat, just to see how far I can go around building database schemas and
Yeah.
large volume messaging solutions and so on and so forth. Because I think that lends itself much more to that sort of coding paradigm than
Mm.
something like a full scale integration, which may have workflows, queuing,
Mm.
asynchronous processing, and so on and so forth. Because that's only bits of code rather than
Yeah.
lots of code.